So we're delighted to be joined today by Professor Geoff Dahl from the University of Florida. So your research, Geoff, in Florida has been primarily focused on dry cow heat stress and the effects of heat stress during the dry period on milk yield and other factors following on from that. Would you like to elaborate a little bit on that?
Yeah, we've done quite a bit of work looking at the impact of heat stress during late gestation, so during the dry period, on the cow and on our calf. And in the cow, there are all negative effects of heat stress in that cow in the next lactation. So she's going to consume less feed when she's dry and heat stressed, and there are definitely effects on mammary growth that then lead to a depression of yield in that next lactation. And usually we're talking about 4 to 5 liters a day less milk out of the cows that were heat stressed during the dry period versus the animals that were cooled during the dry period. There are also some effects on health parameters in those animals. We see depression of immune status both during the dry period and also carryover effects on lower immune status in the cows that were heat stressed when they were dry. So really just nothing positive about heat stress when the cows are dry.
It sounds like what you're saying is that during the dry period, any heat stress in that time frame will have a lasting effect right through the lactation.
Yeah, there are a couple of things to think about with regard to how much heat stress during the dry period impacts cows. We've actually done a study where we'll heat stress them just for half the dry period, either the front half or the back half. And in our case, that's a 6-week total dry period, so 3 weeks of heat stress. And it didn't look like there was any difference whether we heat stressed them for just 3 weeks front or back of the dry period versus the entire dry period.
It still was the same.
They were still depressed in terms of their yield in that next lactation. And the other effects are going to be apparent as well, and particularly those other effects on the calf as they go into the next lactation. The other thing to remember is that heat stress that we impose on the cows causes a permanent effect for that lactation. So even if we see heat stress during lactation, that'll be sort of an acute effect that goes away after they've gotten out of that heat stress situation. But during the dry period, if they're heat stressed, that effect is permanent for that lactation, so they'll always be at a lower level of
So in many ways, it's almost worse to have a heat stress period during that dry.
Well, a little bit of bias, obviously, from the guy researching it, but yeah, that would be our place.
Yeah. What advice would you give to farmers maybe to try and minimize the impacts of heat stress? Obviously, in a pasture-based system, it's difficult to provide the cooling and sprinklers and the fans that may be possible in the American systems. But are there other alternatives like shade, etc., that might be?
Absolutely. That's the first thing to think about. Make sure that cows have access to shade when they're dry. So when we put them on pasture or outside during the dry period, let's make sure that they have some kind of shade structure so that they can get under that and get out of the heat of the day. That's going to obviously reduce the radiation effect on them, but also should provide them with an environment that allows them to cool off more effectively. The other thing that people can consider is if they have soakers or other heat stress abatement systems by the parlor, then they might want to bring those dry cows up a couple of times a day, get them cooled off, get them back out on the pasture under shade. Anything we can do to minimize the increase in rectal temperature is going to be to our advantage. And if they're not sure if their cows have heat stress or not, one good way to go about sort of looking at that in the pasture situation is just measure respiration rate. So measure the breaths per minute that those cows are taking. And if we do that for a minute or so, we can get a good idea of what her heat stress load is. Usually we're looking at 60 breaths per minute as being our threshold that indicates those cows are heat stressed.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually leading on. I guess the question I was going to ask is, how would you define a heat stressed cow?
Yeah, THI is the temperature humidity index, and obviously that's going to be more of an issue for us just because of our much higher humidity in Florida and in other parts of the U.S., particularly during the summer. But I find it's just most effective and easiest for producers to actually measure respiration rate, and that 60 breaths per minute threshold seems to be a good one to use for whether the animals are heat stressed or not.
Well, thank you very much, Geoff. That was really interesting. I think there's a lot of value there for farmers and a lot of food for thought for people in terms of particularly trying to limit the effects of that heat stress in the dry period.